As I get older and life crushes my spirits a little more each year, the things that used to bring me comfort and joy don't do the trick as well as they once did. But for some reason, Halloween is different. If anything, I appreciate and look forward to it more and more each year. It's easily my favorite time of year. And while it isn't traditionally celebrated in Australia, we are definitely huge fans of it. And I've noticed that the generations after mine have embraced it more and more, and I'm so happy about that. Before long, it'll be as big here as it is in the States. Anyways, growing up, one of my favorite things about Halloween was the Simpsons Halloween specials, so I thought I'd do something similar for my channel. Here it is. Enjoy, and happy Halloween, you scumbags. Gloomy Gulch is the fifth world in Donkey Kong Country 2, and the culmination of a subplot hinted at more or less since the beginning of the story. I don't know if culmination or subplot are the right words, but that's something we're going to have to get into more in the official Overthinking DKC 2 series, I think. Since we're kind of pressed for time here, I'll circle back to that at the end of the segment. Before we dive in, seeing as we're dropping in 2/3 of the way through the game, some context wouldn't go astray, so let's do a quick recap of the events up to this point. After the events of Donkey Kong Country, King K. Rool, now going by Captain, kidnaps DK, holding him for ransom in exchange for the newly recovered banana hoard. The Kongs don't negotiate with terrorists, so Diddy and his girlfriend Dixie head to Crocodile Island to rescue him. They reach the island by way of the Gangplank Galleon, K. Rool's trashed flagship. Traveling through Crocodile Cauldron, a volcanic region at the base of the island, they move inland to Krem Key, the original port of the island, now a swampy graveyard for sunken vessels. From there, they travel up to Crazy Kremland, a theme park with non-existent safety standards. The only takeaway I want you to get from their journey thus far is this. The island is clearly in an advanced state of entropy. They're fighting a losing battle against the elements, and they've clearly made bad choices from the get-go in terms of infrastructure, choosing to build a theme park over something more necessary, and building their main port on unstable ground. Gloomy Gulch serves as a sort of threshold, a no man's land between the castle above and the rest of the island below. A natural fortification and a clear divide between the king and his subjects. If you take a look at the world map, you can see that it's quite high in altitude too, high enough to be in the clouds. This high up, it's possible that the thin air could make breathing more difficult, making the journey to the castle that much harder. As for K. Rool, well, he's got an airship, so I doubt he's ever had to make the trek on foot. The altitude could also explain why so many of the trees are dead. The gulch could be on the upper end of the tree line. Looking at the map of Gloomy Gulch, there's really only one man-made structure. We'll get into that place soon, but for now, I just want to acknowledge how empty and lifeless the gulch feels. The only other area comparable to Gloomy Gulch is Crocodile Cauldron, but at least the cauldron had mines and the proximity to other areas going for it. The Kongs first set foot in the Ghostly Grove. This is the first forest level in the game, and that's pretty much its main role here. It's our introduction to Gloomy Gulch, and it does a great job of setting the tone of the world. It's also got killer music. Gameplay wise, the main focus is the disappearing ropes. It's a simple mechanic, easy to learn, not so easy to master. The ropes pull double duty, as they reinforce the world's theme of ghosts and the supernatural. Crossing the threshold of Ghostly Grove, the Kongs stumble across the Haunted Hall, the only man-made structure in the Gulch. This area has a sort of Hansel and Gretel, Tom Bombadil feel to me, though there's nothing enticing about this place. It's the first and only instance of the library level theme, which in a weird way makes it this game's counterpart to Slip Slide Ride from DKC. Here, the Kongs are chased along a roller coaster of all things by Cackle, the ghost of a giant Kremling pirate. What a giant pirate ghost is doing haunting a roller coaster in a giant library haunted house joint thing is beyond me. It makes a wee bit more sense when you look at the original concept for this enemy. Known only as Mr. X, he was supposed to be the pursuer for this level, and it looks like he was going to have a bit more personality and backstory than Cackle got. You can imagine Mr. X as a sort of mad captain that might have led the Kremlings before K. Rool, and maybe retired to his home in the forest or something. Maybe K. Rool usurped him, or maybe he was insane and the Kremling crew mutinied. There's a lot of possibilities, but I guess we'll never know. Anyway, the timer is the core gameplay element. It's constantly ticking down as you race through the level, and if it runs out, Cackle gets a piece of you. You can buy yourself more time by finding the barrels with the green plus symbol, but you've got to watch out for the ones with the red minus, which remove time. The level's structure is super clever. It goes through 4 phases. The first introduces the rules. Get green, avoid red. The second starts you off with very little time and has you focusing on getting as many of the green as you can. The third does the opposite. You start with ample time and must avoid the barrage of red barrels. The final run has both green and red, but they're clustered together, so precision timing your jumps is key to survival. Coming out of the hole, the Kongs step into the Gusty Glade, a patch of forest over deep pits and steep cliffs, coursing with strong, almost unnatural winds. The presence of the wind and the abundance of cliffs could indicate that this part of the forest is quite a ways higher than Ghostly Grove. There are less Kremlings here than in that level, which strengthens that theory a little. At any rate, the wind effect is beautiful, and is the clear focus of the gameplay. You'll get rattly for a bit too, which is always nice. The challenge lies in using the wind to traverse large stretches of space between solid ground, timing your jumps and letting it carry you across, but also trying to avoid letting it throw you astray. The strong and deliberate nature of the wind makes me think that maybe there are supernatural forces at work here. At the edge of the glade, the Kongs are blown into a strange giant hive, not unlike the one seen in Crazy Kremland. Parrot Shoot Panic makes no sense in the context of the Gulch, but this is a game for children and it's already kinda silly how much I deconstruct it. It's a hive level where the objective is to slowly descend by way of Quarks, Squawks' purple, useless relative. That's harsh. I actually really like Quarks. He looks dope and I love how they chop up the gameplay with him in DKC 2 and 3. It could be that the wind from Gusty Glade took them to the top of the hive, and Quarks is helping them descend so that the Kongs can continue their journey. Webbed Woods is the final stretch of forest. It's centered around using Squitter to traverse the huge open pitfalls. Like Gusty Glade, it could be theorized that this area is also quite high in altitude. Another theory can be derived from the environment. All three forests are slightly different in color schemes. Ghostly Grove is all rich, vibrant greens and browns. Gusty Glade is a similar palette but less saturated. But Webbed Woods looks like an entirely different season. The leaves are all brown and dying, the earth looks red, and a dirty rust-coloured fog hangs over everything. The forest seems to be dying. There are quite a few big-name Kremlings here, which makes me think they're stationed at the base of the castle to stop the Kongs from reaching the stronghold. Creepy Crow is the boss of this world, and it's such a cool concept. Turns out, we killed Crow in the battle on Gangplank Galleon's Crow's Nest, and his restless spirit has taken up residence here in the heart of Ghost Country to get his revenge. He's helped by the ghosts of Neki Juniors, who are likely the ones we encountered in the mines and swamps on the way up. Hopefully when we inevitably beat them, their souls are put to rest. I think the presence of the supernatural here is more than a simple theme. I think it's the manifestation of the pain and misery that the island's inhabitants have lived through for the past God knows how many centuries. It's also a grim reminder of the inevitable outcome of their way of life. I doubt the Gulch was haunted before they arrived. In fact, the island itself probably would have looked completely different once upon a time. And if they had their way, DK Island would have suffered a similar fate if not for Donkey and Diddy's intervention. The way the Kremlings seemed to short-sightedly consume everything in front of them, with no regard for nature or the future, was only ever going to end badly for them. When I was first getting into Resident Evil, one extremely small detail in the second game sent my imagination into overdrive. The shutters. I'm serious. The fact that you could actively push back against the Horde, taking steps to defend the police station from the ocean of undead trying to break in, just made the world and our struggle in it feel that much more believable. I get that I'm almost definitely alone here, but it is what it is. As I went on to play RE4 and later the remake, I couldn't understand why this concept wasn't expanded upon in those games. In 4, we see some rudimentary barricading in 2 of the village centerpiece moments, but they're very much peripheral to the meat and potatoes of the fights. In the remake, a game that had my nerves absolutely shot for the entirety of my first playthrough, I yearned for the ability to make use of the furniture in various rooms, to push up against the doors and windows, especially when zombies started breaking into previously secured places. To this day, I still want a Resident Evil game where defending and managing a base is a central element of gameplay. Which brings me, very poorly, to the topic of this segment. What if Resident Evil, specifically Resident Evil 2, was a Metroidvania? Looking at what we've seen of Raccoon City from RE2 and 3 in particular, proves that a more open and interconnected, almost Metroid-style map is not only possible for Resident Evil, but works well. So here's how I'd tackle the idea. Start RE2 the exact same way. Crash, fire, frantic run through the streets of Raccoon City into the police station. It's important to me to preserve the more cinematic qualities of those early RE games in this new approach. What I would do differently here is I'd add a whole mess of little things, from locked doors and blocked passageways to fleeing survivors like Brad in RE3. Nothing you'd be able to do about any of them at this point in the game. They'd be things you'd come back to later on, much later on, because I'd have the police station unfold more or less exactly the same too. It might not make for the best pacing, but I wouldn't want to sacrifice anything, from the puzzles and exploration to the atmosphere. How I'd balance this with the changes in the second half is I'd deepen the original first chunk of the game by having it serve as a tutorial of sorts for what's to come. The gameplay, combat, inventory management, and puzzles are already done well in the original, so it'd just be the additional elements I'm introducing that would need to be worked in. The game would deviate when you reach the parking garage. Once you meet Ada and talk to Ben in the cell, the game would open up by way of the parking entrance, like in the RE2 remake. Leon and Claire would now have access to Raccoon City as a whole. You can be forgiven for wondering why, after reaching the relative safety of the cop shop, anyone would want to leave. Well, I've thought about that, and there are 3 good reasons to venture out into the dangerous unknown of Raccoon City. The first 2, making up the bulk of the gameplay, are to find resources and rescue as many survivors as possible. I'll get to those 2 points in a moment. Your main reason for leaving is something I'd work into the main story. To escape the city, we'd need access to the sewers beneath the police station. We'd need a particular item, be it a medallion, one of the plugs, or just a key, to access the passage out of town. Either through a nearby document, like a diary entry or letter or manifest, or tipped off by Ben, we'd find out that the item in question belongs to a certain individual, likely to be found on the other side of town. Our hand is forced. If we want to leave the city, first we need to go out into danger. And that's when the game truly begins. Like Metroid, certain areas would be inaccessible from the outset. But instead of acquiring new abilities, I'd have the map open up through keys and items like the bolt cutters and fire hose, as well as being a reward for finding survivors. Some would hand over keys, while others could use their unique skill sets to bypass electronic locks or fix roller door motors or whatever. Speaking of survivors, finding them would make up a large part of the game. Throughout the city, we'd find all kinds of signs of life and traces of stories. We'd see people who didn't make it, like the UBCS soldier and the girl in the clock tower. But we'd also find people like Robert Kendo. But maybe in this version of the game, and with your help, he might fare a little better. Maybe this time around, we help him defend and eventually fortify his gun store, and later on he could return the favor, supplying weapons to the survivors in the police station and helping to defend it. Which brings us nicely to the next main part of the game. The main reason for exploring the city is to find the key item needed to escape the police station, but the incentive for exploration, for finding supplies and rescuing survivors, is defending the police station from the assaulting zombies. It's something we'll touch on in the first part of the game. Those barricaded windows in the hallway, they'll break, and Marvin, who I decided is going to survive in this version, gets Leon and Claire to help him put up new boards. That's probably it, aside from finding the occasional board and nails and barricading the occasional door or window, like in the remake. But once we venture out in the city, the assault will begin for real. It'll come from the front, so we'll have a clear focus and won't have to spread our defenses too thin at first. Throughout the city, we'll find boards, nails, and other objects to whip up barricades, fortifications, and traps. And it's our job to take them back to the police station and decide on the best way to use them. Focusing too heavily on barricading one wing or room means others will suffer, and poor management of resources means you might end up having to abandon some rooms altogether. And if you've got survivors stationed in those areas, you can kiss them goodbye. Supplies too. If you designated a room for medical supplies or ammunition, that room's now lost, unless you want to fight through several dozen zombies to get it back. There'd be very real consequences for mistakes. And that's why there's a personal stake in rescuing survivors too. Aside from being the right thing to do, of course. They can help defend the building. They can patch up wounded survivors and repair damaged fortifications while you're away. The climax of the game would begin after finding the item needed to escape the city. Returning to the police station would trigger the final fight. One huge wave of zombies, and finally, either Mr. X or William Birkin. Speaking of those two, I wouldn't have them in the police station at all for the bulk of the game. Mr. X would be a combination of Nemesis and his enhanced role in the remake, patrolling the city at random and drawn to you by the noises you make. William would appear during more scripted moments. He'd be found close to wherever you run into Sherry or Annette, and depending on the order you encounter those two, his story and theirs could end up going in a number of directions. Your actions during your encounters with those two will dictate their appearance in the final fight. If you've exhausted every inch of the city, saved all the survivors, and been smart with your resources, the zombie siege event should be a piece of piss, and after the survivors escape, you'll be more than ready for the final boss fight. But if you've blasted through the main quest with little energy spent on the extra stuff, the police station is lost. Any survivors in the building will be quickly overrun, and you'll have no choice but to flee the police station. You might get out of having to fight the final boss, but it's essentially the bad ending. One more thing I want to work in is the sheer amount of world building and lore we'd get to see in a game like this. Each and every survivor would have a story to tell, a history within the city. We'd see their journal entries, letters both to and from them, and hear of their exploits around the city from others. There'd be an added incentive to seek out documents too, as passwords and the locations of key items would be found within. They'd have connections and relationships with other survivors, and that might even come into play in the police station. Putting people who work well together in the same room could give them both a performance boost, and keeping people who are at odds apart could prevent potential infighting or sabotage. I feel like we'd have to scrap the sewer and lab sections of the original game, but it'd be worth it to be able to explore a fully realized Raccoon City. The video game movie curse is this long debated idea that video games don't translate well to film, and most, if not all previous attempts strengthen this position. I have always called bullshit on this, and rightfully so. Ever since the first video game adaptations, the idea has been put to rest. The first 5 video game films were Mario Bros., Double Dragon, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Mortal Kombat Annihilation, in that order. 3 of those movies are absolutely brilliant. One of them I haven't seen. One of them is Mortal Kombat Annihilation. That's a pretty good spread, but still, with every semi-decent video game adaptation, someone somewhere screams from the rooftops that this is finally the film to break the video game curse. And so, I'd like to informally introduce a new series, one I've been working on since before the release of my first video, Curse Breakers. Here, I'll take a game and challenge myself to translate it into film in a way that preserves the spirit of the source material, but successfully adapts to the new medium. Since it's Halloween, I've decided to try my hand at Medievil, one of, if not the, most Halloween-esque video games ever. It's no secret that Medievil was heavily influenced by The Nightmare Before Christmas and Danny Elfman. So right there, a lot of the heavy lifting is already done. We've established the perfect medium, aesthetic, and soundtrack. Probably leave out the musical numbers, but I mean, you could write some pretty great songs about Medievil if that's what you wanted to do. The story itself is also perfect for adaptation. It's in the details that it starts to get a bit messy. For this series, we'll be sticking with tried and true formulas like the hero's journey for plotting out the film adaptations of various games. And in this case, we'll be using Blake Snyder's beat sheet, as seen in his popular but divisive screenwriting guide, Save the Cat. Save the Cat gets a lot of shit, but the fact remains that it's a great resource for writing stories, and I can't recommend it enough to anyone with ambitions for film or fiction. Blake Snyder theorizes that most films can be broken down into these 15 plot beats. Because this isn't a fully fledged Curse Breakers video, I don't want to get too deep into it. The 15 beats are neatly broken up into 3 acts, so let's quickly go over them instead. Act 1 sets up the world as it is before the events of the film. The overall theme or lesson of the film is outlined here, and the dissatisfaction the hero feels towards their current circumstances is made apparent. This act or setting is sometimes referred to as thesis, or the thesis world. Act 2 is the antithesis, often marked by a literal crossing of the threshold. Alice enters Wonderland. The T-Rex escapes its enclosure in Jurassic Park. Neo takes the red pill. Act 2 makes up the bulk of the movie, and it's where the action is. Whatever promise the trailer or whatever lured you in with is made good here. There's a clear midpoint, and more often than not, things start to go downhill for the good guys after that. Act 2 peters out at the lowest point, often punctuated by the death of a character close to the protagonist. This loss ultimately leads to change, with the main character going through their dark night of the soul and becoming stronger for it. This newfound strength kicks off Act 3, the synthesis of the 2 previously opposing ideals, and leads to the climactic battle against the villain. Coulson's death unites the Avengers against Loki. Obi-Wan sacrifices himself for Luke. who in turn uses Obi-Wan's guidance to fire the 1 in a million shot during the Death Star run. Chubbs' death motivates Happy Gilmore to be good at golf. Good triumphs over evil, the world is saved, homeostasis is reached, roll credits. That's very simplified, doesn't apply to every film ever made, and has its detractors, but it does work. Classics are classics for a reason, baby. So how would Medieval fit into this 3-act structure? Here's the plot of Medieval, ripped straight out of Wikipedia. In the year 1286, an evil sorcerer named Zarok plotted to take over the kingdom of Gallowmere with his undead army. It is told in legend that the champion, Sir Daniel Fortescue, led the king of Gallowmere's army to victory and managed to kill Zarok before he succumbed to his mortal wounds. In reality, however, Dan was struck down by the first arrow fired in the battle, with the king choosing to cover it up and declare Dan the hero of Gallowmere. Zarok, meanwhile, went into hiding. 100 years later, Zarok reappears, casting a spell over Gallowmere to plunge it into eternal night, awaken his undead army, and steal the souls of the living. However, in the process, he unwittingly revives Dan, who has over time become a skeletal corpse, missing his jaw, which fell off, and the left eye he lost in the Battle of Gallowmere. Having been unable to ascend to the fabled Hall of Heroes for his ignoble death, Dan uses this opportunity to defeat Zarok, save Gallowmere, and earn his place as a true hero. It's a simple plot, but simple's good, and deceptively difficult to do well. You've got setting, backstory, a hero, a villain, conflict, and motivation, all conveyed clearly and effectively. And that more or less makes up our first act. The game itself is Act 2, and Act 3 is the final climactic battle. We open on a sweeping shot of Gallowmere on the eve of battle. Sir Daniel Fortescue moves around the troops, followed by his page, Canny Tim. I love the idea of Dan being voiced by Morgan Freeman or Sam Elliott, because for most of the film, he has no jaw, so he kinda just mumbles. For this part of the film, every time he goes to say something, he'll be interrupted or drowned out by the action. Anyway, it's clear that despite his status, the troops don't really respect him. He's good-hearted and they like him, but they look to his first lieutenant, Stanya Ironhewer, for direction. A part of it is Dan's tendency for showmanship, influenced by his idolization of Woden the Mighty, Gallowmere's greatest hero, who long ago banished the shadow demons to their prison beneath the enchanted forest. Battle starts, Dan leads the charge and is immediately shot through the eye. Cut to black, the sound of the ocean as we fade back in. Dan wakes up on a boat, being ferried to the Hall of Heroes by the boatman, who tells him he's dead. Shortly after, they pick up Canny Tim, who fills Dan in on what happened after he died. Tim himself avenged Dan by taking out Zarok's general, Kardok, with a shot through the eye at 1,000 paces. With Kardok down, Zarok's forces fell apart and Stanya led Gallowmere to victory, but not before Zarok got revenge on Canny Tim. At the Hall of Heroes, they're greeted by their personal hero, Woden the Mighty. He lets Tim in, but not Dan, telling Dan that he never did anything in life worthy of a place at the table. Never meet your heroes, kids. And so Dan is forced to walk the afterworld alone. 100 years later, Zarok, who somehow survived the battle, enacts his revenge. He casts a spell of Evernight, sending Gallowmere into endless night, then possesses its inhabitants and raises the dead. This inadvertently returns Dan to his body. He's missing his jaw and an eye, and also he's a skeleton. He's confused about his surroundings, and while it's hinted at, it's not revealed until he makes it out of his crypt and to the surface. There he sees it, his name above the cemetery gates and a huge statue of him, with a plaque calling him the hero of Gallowmere. It talks about how he valiantly slayed Zarok and won the day before succumbing to his wounds. He realizes what he meant to the people of Gallowmere and how he failed them in life by caring more about himself. As he looks at what Zarok's done to his kingdom, he can't help but feel responsible. Canny Tim appears before him as a ghost and tells Dan that this is his chance at redemption. You're already dead, what have you got to lose? Emboldened, Dan opens the gates that bear his name and steps through. Unbeknownst to our heroes, Zarok watches from outside the hilltop mausoleum. Cut to our boys walking through the Scarecrow fields. As they walk, Tim tells Dan that Woden told him to find the artifact in the sleeping village, because it's the one thing Zarok needs to succeed. But soon, Tim's getting spooked, seeing movement in the fields. As they get further in, the scarecrows in the fields get closer and closer, closing in like that one shot of the raptors in the Lost World. At the height of the tension, the scarecrows attack. Dan fends them off for a bit, but eventually loses his nerve and runs into the cornfields, which is the worst place he could have gone. The dynamics and pacing drop to a quiet hum as Dan's jumping at shadows. After some jump scares, he sees the windmill above and runs towards it. He makes it out of of the field and locks himself inside the window. The scarecrows can be heard moving outside, trying to get to him. As he backs away from the door, he knocks a lever on the spider harvester thing. It bursts through the wall and carves a path through the fields. At Tim's suggestion, Dan chases after it, staying on the path and out of the wheat or whatever it is. The machine runs into the mill, causing it to come apart. Dan runs through it as it collapses, jumping and ducking the various bits and pieces in a clear nod to the scene from the game. He rolls down a hill, landing in a pumpkin patch. He breathes a sigh of relief as he thinks he's out of the mess, but at that moment, the pumpkins around him come to life and attack. The roots come alive and grab at Dan as he flees the pumpkins. He gets away just long enough to catch his breath and gets a look at the sleeping village close by. There's a tunnel leading from the dried out riverbed into the village that's teeming with writhing vines. The two quietly move through the field of shallow water with beached fish and gnarled roots to the opening in the wall. As Dan cuts at the vines with his sword, the Pumpkin King roars and comes to life. Dan fights against it, but makes no headway. Tim notices the king's pods giving it strength, and tells Dan to attack them instead. He does, and the king grows weak. Dan deals the killing blow, and the vines in the wall recede. They emerge in the sleeping village, where its possessed inhabitants all patrol the streets. Tim mentions that they're essentially Zarok's puppets, and for Dan not to hurt them. They move through the town, sneaking through alleyways and in and out of familiar buildings, until eventually they're discovered at the Troll's Head Bar, where the villagers proceed to beat the absolute piss out of Dan. I'd play it up for gags, as he'd essentially have to let it happen because he can't really hurt them back. He's thrown out the window, where he's chased by an angry mob to the mayor's house. He gets in through the chimney, and while he's frantically trying to barricade the place, he finds the safe containing the artifact. Tim finds some evidence that points to the asylum, and notices that he can't hear the mob outside anymore. Looking out the window, they see Zarok's minions, these demonic clockwork dudes, blocking the way out of town and rounding up the villagers. They're looking for the artifacts too. Sneaking out of the village, the two heroes make it to the asylum easily enough. Meeting the mayor, he recognizes them both and gives them the key to the safe, telling them the artifact is in safe hands if the hero of Galomir wants it. He also tells Dan to head down into the basement because there's someone waiting for him there. Turns out it's Stanya. He's still alive, and despite being well over 100 years old, he recognizes them both and says he knew Dan would return, which might explain why he's in here. Long story short, they let him out, he grabs his hammer somehow, frees all the inmates and leads a riot all the way back to the village. Dan and Tim do their best to avoid the inmates as they follow the chaos back to the village. Stanya and the inmates duke it out with the robots, allowing Dan to recover the artifact and escape through the village gates, over the river. Cut to the two walking through the forest. Dan's looking at the artifact in his hand, a jet black, desiccated demon claw. Neither Dan nor Tim can really figure out what's so special about it when suddenly they're surprised by the witch of the forest. She tells them to take it to the cave in the deepest part of the forest, so they do, and accidentally unleash the shadow demons imprisoned there. As the demons run rampant over the forest, Tim tells Dan to get to higher ground, climbing up toadstools, rope bridges, and probably other stuff. Dan finds himself atop a giant tree, where, after stopping the demonettes from taking some giant bird eggs, he sees Peregrine Castle in the distance. All the demons are flying towards it. Chased out of the nest by the mother bird, he falls down into the trees and rolls down towards the edge of the forest. Face down in the mud as it begins to rain, he raises his head to find himself in the pools of the ancient dead. As he walks towards the castle, he looks around and sees the remains of Zarok's warriors strewn about the field. But it's not until he sees the Fortescue crest on a shield that it sinks in. This is the same battlefield where he lost his life. As the weight of his failure starts to set upon him, Lord Kardok appears out of the rain, as if summoned. After a painfully short fight, Dan is defeated, and there in the rain, he lies surrounded by his fallen comrades. He awakes outside the Hall of Heroes, and still he cannot enter. Woden himself greets him at the entrance above the clouds. He tells Dan the true story of the Shadow Demons, how it was through his own hubris that they were unleashed, and it almost led to the destruction of Galomir, maybe the world. If not for this, then he might not have had the courage to do what he had to do, sacrificing himself to seal them up in the Enchanted Earth. Heroes make mistakes, but Woden was lucky because he got a chance to fix his. Dan has that same chance. When they first met, Woden saw the worst of himself in Dan. Now, Woden sees the best of himself in him. He gives Dan his golden broadsword, imbued with powerful magic, as well as a chalice from the table, telling him to place it on the pedestal in Zarok's lair. Then, along with Canny Tim, Dan is sent back to Earth. When Dan awakes, he's in the ruins of Peregrine Castle, surrounded by the villagers who managed to escape Zarok's possession. They recognized him as the hero of legend when they saw him on the battlefield and brought him back here. They know he'll defeat Zarok and they want to help him. Kenny Tim tells them they need to get to Zarok's lair fast, so they put Dan into a catapult and shoot him through the air. Dan crashes through a window and falls down to the bottom of the lair, finding himself in what appears to be a clockwork city. A lot of electricity and dials and stuff, as well as the robot soldiers from before. Dan and Tim look around, amazed and confused, but don't really have the time to stick around. As they make their way to the top of the lair, they see the shadow demons out the window going for the villagers camped at the ruins. They need to work fast. In a great chamber beneath orbiting planets, Dan confronts Zarok, who unleashes his undead bodyguards, but not before Dan slams the chalice down on the pedestal. The heroes of the hall all appear behind him, and back him up as Dan goes after the fleeing Zarok. Just as it looks like Dan's gonna catch him, Kardok cuts him off. He's riding a giant skeletal steed on fire, and he's even more menacing than at the pools of the ancient dead. He begins some grand villain speech, but is quickly cut off by an arrow through his remaining eye. He goes nuts like the lady in Kill Bill 2, while Kenny Tim is in absolute disbelief at how good the shot was. While Kardok is throwing a tantrum, Dan calmly walks past and corners Zarok in an arena. Zarok disappears, does the scene from the game where he can't find the right spell, then reappears as a dragon. Dan beats him, the place comes down, and Dan is saved by the bird whose eggs he saved before. The townsfolk, who all survived the destruction of the lair, cheer him on. Someone somewhere makes a joke about what a cop-out that ending is, and why the mother bird couldn't have just taken him straight to Zarok's lair to begin with. The camera flows through the sleeping village to the graveyard, mirroring the introduction as the townsfolk are freed from Zarok's control and the Evernight spell disappears, bringing in the dawn of a new day. It spirals down the stairs of Dan's crypt, where the scene of Dan returning to his long sleep plays out just like it does in the game. Cut to the Hall of Heroes. Dan's at the head of the table, celebrating with his fellow heroes as they all celebrate their victory. Or, you know, something like that. Full disclosure, this episode released a full month after it was supposed to because I simply couldn't get this final segment into shape. It went through a bunch of incarnations and I did a ton of research, and this was the best I could do. I like the result, but I don't love it, and I obviously left out a whole lot of detail because I was trying to fit it into the same shorter time frame as the other segments. Good news is, there's a ton of material for new videos that came out of the work, so maybe we'll see all the stuff that didn't make it into this segment in future. So there you have it, the first ever Definitely Mitch Halloween special. I hope you liked it. I had fun making it. I did whip it up fairly quickly, so it wasn't as in-depth as previous episodes. But that said, I'm still happy with how it turned out, for the most part. I definitely want to continue this series in future, so future specials should hopefully be a tad more fleshed out. Before I go, I just want to take a moment to express how grateful I am for everyone that watches my stuff. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, but somehow, my weird, hyper-fixated dives into some of my favorite games have found some people that it resonates with. And lucky for me, those people turned out to be pretty damn cool. Talking Donkey Kong and Resident Evil with you all has been an unexpected but very welcome highlight of an otherwise train wreck of a year, and I want you all to know that I don't take any of it for granted. Happy Halloween, you beautiful bastards. I love you all. Alright, I think it's over.